Teal. Sorry, we've got various messages coming up on screen. Great. Okay. If we can start on screen, if that's okay. The way we play this game is I will ask somebody to introduce themselves, and then once you've done that, if you can ask somebody, and we'll just kind of move through the screen in that way. So just to kick off, Sarah Wright, is it okay if you start the proceedings for us?
Hi, Teal. Hi, everybody. Thanks very much. It's great to be here again. So I am at Royal Holloway, and I work on Spanish cinema, Chilean cinema, and I've previously worked on a project with Steffi Donald on The Child in cinema.
Thank you. So if you can invite somebody to...
Okay, I will invite Kat, please.
Thank you.
Hi there, my name's Kat. I work as research coordinator and access support worker at an alternative art school called Open School East in Margate. And I'm also undertaking a part-time practice-related PhD in artistic approaches to art history pedagogy at Royal Holloway in the Department of Drama, Theatre and Dance.
Perfect. Thank you. We'll hear more about you in a minute. If you can ask somebody then.
Ruth?
Hi, thanks. I'm Ruth Hemus. I'm at Royal Holloway as well in languages, literatures and cultures. And my research is on Dada and Surrealism, women in the avant-garde, historical avant-garde, and then also more recent contemporary women. I'm working on a volume at the moment for Edinburgh University Press on avant-garde women. And I am going to go to Gareth.
Thanks, Ruth. So I'm Gareth. I've just submitted my thesis on contemporary French poetry. I've been working on contemporary French poetry at Royal Holloway, and I'm also, I was the Research Centre Associate at the Centre for Visual Cultures, and I've presented in a previous workshop, so I'm very glad to be back and update you on my progress. Maybe I could introduce Eric, my supervisor.
Thanks, Gareth.
Happy to.
Thank you, and well done. I'm Eric Robertson. I'm a professor of text and image in modern languages, and a founding member of the Centre for Visual Cultures, and currently working on, amongst other things, an exhibition on Kurt Schwitters at the Picasso Museum in Paris, which is opening in the autumn. And I'm terribly ill-equipped to deal with Zoom, so there are not many people on my screen, but I do see James. So James, over to you.
If you've gone back on, there you
go. Can you hear me okay? It's a bit capricious Zoom on this end too. Thank you, Eric. And so I'm James Williams, Director of the Centre for Visual Cultures at Royal Holloway, Professor of French. Specialties are cinema, Francophone cinema, but also Holocaust cinema. And to come back to Steffi, who's already been flagged by Sarah, Steffi, who is on my screen, and she will reveal herself if she's not yet on your screen. Steffi and Eric Donald, then, with whom I co-organised recently a conference on a contemporary French Senegalese filmmaker, Alice Diop, Saint-Omer. Can I actually pass to Min Zhu? And I'm going to pass to Min because it's because of me, Min, that you are here, I think. Are you actually in China right now?
I'm in China right now. It's in the middle of the night.
Yeah, welcome.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for this invitation. I'm actually very new here. My project, my potential postdoctoral project, is supervised by James. So I was very curious about what the visual center is like. So he very kindly invited me to this activity. So I'm really interested in your research, and I had a look at the content of each speaker's research. Yeah, I currently I'm doing queer aesthetics projects and cross-cultural aesthetics. Yeah, that's all about me. I'm currently a researcher and assistant professor in China at Xi'an University. Yeah, glad to meet you all here.
Great. Thanks for joining and for being up in the middle of the night to participate as well. Well done. Is there someone you want to pass on the introduction to?
Should I pass it to someone else?
Yes, please.
Can I pass it to Joyce? I'm not sure if I pronounce it correctly.
Oh, Juice.
Joyce Ku.
Yeah, Juice.
Hi,
Yeah.
I'm here. I could hear you. Yeah, it's just a bit of like a network issue because I'm not in London currently. I'm in Latvia, and yeah, I'm going to start my concert very soon. So yeah, I'm a freelancer, like kind of a sound artist, and doing sort of like a composition and researching like sonic theater and 5 elements in like Eastern philosophy. So yeah, that's kind of about me. Sorry about the network issue. It's a bit problematic here. So yeah.
Juice, thanks for joining us. And Carolyn's just let me know about your concert as well. So thanks for joining us. But I assume you'll be slipping out in a bit to go perform in Riga.
Yeah, I'm going to perform, I think, in like half an hour. And I will be performing in half an hour, and I will be joining back again.
Okay, great.
So kind of like yeah, I'm kind of shuffling around, and here is the sort of like the venue, and yeah, and show you something interesting is the button. So it's like a lot of things going on here, but yeah.
That's okay. Can you see anybody else on the screen that you would like to invite them to introduce themselves, please?
Yeah, I would like to pass to Yunqi, if that's okay.
Yeah, I know that.
Because you put a thumbs up, so I'm gonna invite you. Yay.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So nice to see you all, and nice to be here again. Last year I was also here as a speaker. So my name is Yunqi. I'm a graphic designer. I am an independent publisher, and I'm the third-year PhD candidate at the School of Communication at the Royal College of Art. So the keyword of my research is book, but it's not the book that you are always approaching to. And I will have a more introduction in detail in my following lecture. In to give a conclusion, it's more like a kind of situated practice-led research about a kind of specific scenario when graphic designer is trying to use a strategy to face to the complicated situation of the publishing. So yeah. Can I pass to Grant?
Thank you, Yunqi. Good evening, everybody. I'm Graham Newman. I'm a first-year PhD researcher at the School of Communication, and I am looking at testamentary traces of contested design knowledge, and that's situated in the Department of Design Research, which is active here between 1965 and 1985. Hopefully you'll hear about this later on today. So it's lovely to see you all. Is there anyone that we've missed on the screen? Judith.
Hello, I'm an independent researcher. Sorry, my name's Judith Medic, as you can see on the screen. I'm a former colleague of Teal's as well from many years ago when I used to work in art colleges. I've worked quite widely in the arts. And I did my PhD at Royal Holloway on memory studies or memories of the Spanish Civil War and how those were represented in literature. And I'm now turning it into a book over quite a long period. I've been working on that as well as doing other things.
Thanks, Judith. And I think Archana.
Yeah, thanks to you. Thanks, everyone. Hi, my name is Archana Prasad. I am a first year PhD, School of Communications at RCA. My research looks at inclusive AI. How can we put artistic practice, creative practice at the very center, and in fact, ideally at the lead of technology, especially these technologies? Is there a response to the Silicon Valley approach to these kinds of technologies? I am not there in person, unfortunately, but just wanted to give you guys a peek of what I'm doing. I don't know if you can tell. Oh yeah, sorry, I have it all blurred out, don't I? But I'm in the middle of shooting a textile archive as part of my PhD, our research work, and yeah, I'm very excited to be here and listen to all of you.
That's great. And we'll hear more from you next week as well about your project.
That's right.
Okay. And it's Sean, I think. I think that's the last person on the screen. Sarah. Oh, yeah. Steffi.
Okay.
And Steffi. Yeah, sorry. Okay. Sean, you go ahead and we'll press it on.
Okay, cool. Hi, everyone. I'm Sean Gao, and I'm a second year PhD student at School of Communication. And I am based, my research is titled Unveiling Chinese Porcelains in Modifications to Current International Presentation. And I'm also the next week's presenter to talk more about my research. But basically, it is the research is investigating how Chinese porcelains as a culture, materiality, and representation are being interpreted, curated, and also displayed in the cross-cultural museum context. And my current case studies are covering museums, including the Palace Museum in Beijing, the V&A in London, and also the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Yeah.
And then Sarah. Steffi.
Me, yeah.
Sarah, go first.
Yeah, when there's two Sarahs, it can get confusing. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I never know with the headphones. My name is Sarah. I am a second year practice-based PhD student at Royal Holloway, looking at relationships between art and writing through a few kind of lenses, but kind of mainly translation, transmission, and resonance. And I presented my research last year at this very seminar, and I've also just kind of wrapped up some research assistant work with the CVC. Yeah, so really excited to see all the presentations today.
Thanks. And Steffi?
Yes, I'm Steffi, and as James said, I'm working with him on the Saint-Omer project. I've also worked on childhood and cinema with Sarah and other people over the years. I have a background in Chinese visual arts and film, which is what I spent my first 20 years of my career focusing on. And I'm now, I'm now mainly interested in childhood cinema and migration broadly taken. I've also just started a job as a bookseller, so I'm listening to all the presentations about books, very interested.
Great, thank you. Busy. Brilliant. Did I get everybody on screen now? Are we good there? Excellent. Okay, now into the room. Rowena, can we start with you?
Yeah. You know, sure. Hello, I'm Rowena, a first-year researcher in the railroad part, and my research topic is in the area of toy, which I call toyology, and I'm doing research. Hi. I'm doing research about why we're so ignorant about the power of twice as an ideology carriers. And I'm looking to miniature word twice very specifically. And I'm looking into how do people utilize it as a storytelling medium and how can we utilize that mechanism to develop it as a tool, as a model for alternative realities.
Hi, I'm Laura. I'm a second year PhD and I had my confirmation this morning, so I'm a little bit brain dead. Forgive me. But I am looking at Orientalism and the staging of identity and Egypt specifically, and how I can use constellatory identification to help deconstruct these systems of oppression using immersive theater.
Hi everybody, I'm Zini and I'm a first year student, and I currently my research is focused on the audiovisual arts and visual music about digital materialities. Yes, and okay, I'm a percussionist. Okay.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Gareth. I'm in the first year at the School of Communication, and my research is about the temporal capital of becoming legible on social media, short form media. My background is pop music. Yes.
We have a lot of musicians and performers in the group today. Right?
I also make music. I make electronic music, and I work with sound. And my PhD is looking at how do we understand ourselves through listening. Basically, it's based on listening practices, and think about how to share the listening creatively.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm John. Thank you. Yeah, and I explore censorship in video games, or in the video culture, particularly in video games. And I focus on compensatory imagination. It means when players use their imagination to fill gaps with something like content images be censored. Yeah.
Thank you. And Carmen?
Yeah. Yeah, my name is Carmen. So I'm a lecturer in animation degrees and culture at the University of Hertfordshire, but I'm also kind of like at the end of my PhD studies here at the RCA School of Communication. And my thesis kind of proposes a study of the creation of meaning through metaphors, and particularly within the kind of like the formative analysis of experimental animated works. And I'm kind of like bringing that into critical discussion and reflection using for recurse hermeneutics metaphor.
Thank you very much. He's very good. Okay, that's us on this side. So thanks. You can see what richness of subjects we've got in this group. Absolutely amazing. Real privilege to be here. So to move swiftly on, I think we've got everybody now in the room and on screen. Just to say in terms of the format for this evening, we're going to have our 4 speakers, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll go into a Q&A session. So what I recommend is to keep notes of any questions that you may have for our speakers or any comments. If you want to put things in the chat, if that's easier to notate, do that, and then we can always go back through those and match them up to the speakers and get some responses. But the idea is that we have a good conversation following a really good set of speakers and subject areas. So if that sounds okay, we've got each of our speakers is briefed to give a presentation around 10 to 15 minutes. We'll try to keep to time on that. And then they'll give us probably a little over a half hour to have a discussion. to see what themes are emerging, what kind of research challenges might be taking place, what kind of methods that might be shared across the speakers, and importantly, the subject itself, and being able to kind of have that conversation with each other and get different perspectives from all the kind of wonderful lenses that we've got in the room and on screen this evening. So does that sound okay to everybody? Yeah, James is shaking yes, so I'm taking my cue from James. Brilliant. So we're going to start with Kat, and then Yunqi, and then Gareth, and end up with Graham. So Kat, we invite you to show your presentation and share on screen.
Great, there we go. Is that visible to people?
Yep, it is. And we've just got a little bit of thunder and lightning going on, so apologies that we all looked up at the same time.
Fab. So let me jump in. Today I'm going to be talking about one strand of my PhD research. I'm in year 3 of 6, it's part-time. And this strand is called Teaching is the Most Radical Form of Expression Ever to Exist. And it takes the form of a dual-channel 35mm slide installation that I'll actually be opening on Wednesday the 10th next week at the Boiler House Auditorium at Royal Holloway. And so I thought I'd give a little intro just to my wider project before going into the specific strand. So, sorry. Where are we? Let me try something else. There we go. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Great. Apologies. Let's try again. So my wider thesis is looking at artistic approaches to art history pedagogy, so how we teach in art history, specifically in UK higher education. And specifically, I'm interested in how artistic pedagogies might offer more and different access to the past, as well as how these pedagogies might be employed by teachers in amateur and DIY ways towards transformational ends. And I wanted to focus just for a second on the idea of transformational, because I think it's a term that in arts education has potentially been overused or perhaps emptied of some meaning. But the trans here is really important, the moving across between over the sort of formation of the self, the form of the self, whilst learning, Learning is changed through experience, and that's all about the transformation of who we are and who we think we can be. And that's really my interest here. And then just in terms of the events and publications from which my project is seeded, it really started for me when I read a series of 52 interviews published in Art History Journal, brought together by Catherine Grant and Dorothy Price at the Courtauld. And it was in the wake of the Rhodes Must Fall protests in Cape Town, and on the eve of the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent resurgence of the decoloniser curriculum movement in UKHE, but very profoundly felt in art history. And there was one respondent, Kamini Volodi, and they were all asked, where does art history go from here? Do our methods still work? And Kamini summarised it quite beautifully. She said, critical historiography and the introduction of new material that challenges the dominance of Euro-American content, so a diversification of the curriculum, needs to be accompanied by a loosening of the project of knowing from our disciplinary roots and on the practice of other ways of thinking, knowing and learning. And that's what I really got interested. What other ways of teaching and learning I might be able to explore and bring forward as someone trained in both art and art history. And the title of this strand of work, of this slide installation, is taken from a book by Jorge Luzerno, who's a conceptual artist and educator. And the book's called Teachers, Arts and Residence. And in the book, Luzerno proposes that teaching is the most radical form of expression ever to exist, which I think is really beautiful, but deserves unpacking, particularly the term radical, which for me takes 2 strands of interest. One is the radical, the radixal, the root-like, the kind of the thing that spreads in a large, vast web underground from the grassroots up. And as Angela Y. Davis said, the grasping things at the root. The other understanding of radical that I'm interested in here is the kind of rupture with the everyday. That beautiful moment I'm sure we've all had when we're learning, when our values, the knowledge that we hold, how we orient ourselves in relation to others changes because of something we've learned or an interaction we've had that's changed how we know or the limits of what we know. So I'm particularly interested in this expression and this proposition from Luzerno. And in this book, he makes the argument that teachers have latent or ignored expertise that take them perilously close to being artists who are able to enact this radical form of expression. And this is really my proposition too. It's a very DIY proposition, which is you've already got all the tools you need. And in art history in particular, we have a series of tools that artists have also taken up, at least since the 1970s. These include slide projection. They include storytelling, so the creation of a speculative and narrative space in which we can embed ourselves kind of emotionally and invest ourselves, kind of plot and map ideas in. These include diagrams, those beautiful kind of visual captures of thinking happening in real time when we're in a class together, and which of course we see in so many contemporary artworks, such as the work of Joseph Beuys or even Jeremy Deller. The creation of verbal images, that incredible moment when the art historian takes an image off the screen, often behind them, and extracts it and translates it through words into this new form that the class then share in as they create this new artifact out of the image. And of course, also of performative gestures, which I realise I do quite a lot of when I talk, which pull information out of the body and kind of put them into shared space. It's almost kind of instructional form of teaching, but often used in art history and other classes with kind of visual imagery to point at sources and texts, to draw out parts of an image that we want to focus on, maybe even to re-perform or reenact a certain element of a work of art that we want to interrogate further through performance and dramatization of those ideas. And just a quick note on slide projection, because I know it's quite a specific medium, but I use slide projection, and I have done for the last 5 years, because it's so fascinating in art history. It was a primary pedagogical tool in art history from its inception in 1840 through until 1990. So it's really how art historians built ideas. And interestingly, it was often dual channel format. And this is because art history has a background in science and in analysis and in analysing the differences between things to create categories. But of course, out of this media came the Panofskian tradition of comparative visual analysis. And I'm particularly interested in slide projection for these reasons and for their kind of rootedness within art history's ways of knowing, and in how I, as an artist, might intervene in kind of creative, playful ways with the slide projection to think about alternative outcomes. And so over the last, kind of 3 years that I've been undertaking this research, I've been looking at examples of artistic approaches to teaching in art history. And of course, there are many you can draw from museum education, and I do in the rest of my thesis. But one of the earliest and most well-documented that I could find was in the atelier of Jacques-Louis David, who was the artistic director of the French Revolution, a painter, an academic painter, a classicist. And he painted this work, which you can see in the photo here. And just to note, this is a photo I took in the library. It's not actually in the slide projection. But he painted this work in 1784. And it's really an image of civic duty and familial loyalty. It's called the Oath of the Horatii. And it really became the image of the loyalty and devotion that one was expected to give to the state, even if that was at the cost of one's own kind of family, in effect. But what I was so interested in was that in 1784, when David showed this work in the Salon in Paris, a group of very young artists gathered around him, interested in his techniques and wanting to work with him. And so he formed a teaching atelier in his studio in the Louvre. And with these students, David started to develop a really beautiful, quite radical form of performative pedagogy, where he would invite his students to kind of reenact scenes through kind of entering into the gestural space of the characters that they would see on sculptures or vases or read about in plays and poems from the classical world that they were studying. He would invite them to build these papier-mâché costumes and sets in which they would situate these scenes. And they would also use whatever they had around them to create costumes, like dust sheets for robes, etc., from which they would then draw and paint. And what I was really interested in was how David invited his students to enter into the gestural, but also the mental space of the characters, to dramatize the work in their time, for their time. And so fascinatingly, what happened was that a group of David's students, who called themselves the meditators or the bearded, actually broke off from his atelier believing that he was moving too far towards the Baroque effectively, and not leading a true enough classical life to be able to depict these themes in his own works. And I was fascinated in the kind of power of this performative pedagogy and the way in which it impacted his students. And so I started to look at kind of dramatization and dramatization as a tool in teaching. I found this beautiful summary of it by Robert Porter and Cutler-Mckenzie, who are political theorists. And they say dramatization is a practical, critical, and artistic method for the determination of concepts. So it's trialing them in real time, setting them against other things and other spaces, other bodies and objects, other ideas. Do they work in practice? And the aim of this method, therefore, is to appreciate the conditions that explain why certain concepts are pertinent, relevant, and useful or not, as concepts that provoke thought about the world and our place in it. And what's so interesting for me is that DeVry students really took this to the extreme. They didn't necessarily critique the classical world that they saw as much as represent it and decide that they wanted to live in it. And I was interested in how we might look at this kind of performative pedagogy of David, but resist falling into this trap of simply representing the images and stories in these works. And so I started to work with an art historian who I often collaborate with, who's also an artist, but not a trained performer, called Peng. And we started to think about how we might reenact this painting, how we might dramatize it to engage differently in these gestural spaces. It's a really complex painting ethically to teach because it's such a virulent nationalist scene. And we started to explore how we might use intertitles, for example, to cut through some of the kind of potent masculinity of this image, particularly, must I add, in a time in which we're seeing such a strong rise of reform and the kind of bombing of England flags around so many of our towns and cities, including in Margate, where we did the shoot. So that was particularly on our mind, how not to represent this nationalist energy. And that's where the second strand of research that feeds this work really comes in, and where some of the humour and what one might call prestige started to arrive. I went to a workshop called Theatricalising the Classroom, led by dancer teacher Beth Kirkjian at the Baltic. And she was looking particularly at ADHD-oriented approaches to teaching art and art history. She gave a sort of framework for doing this. She said, use props around you, improvise with what you got. Dramatise ideas, perform characters, use humour, including vaudeville-like indignities, as you'll see later, like covering yourself in post-it notes, and suddenly being very much at the mercy of this incredibly fragile and unpredictable material, and stimulate your class. And so I started to think about how I might enter these techniques into the slide projection work that I was developing with Ben. And somebody actually called it a private performance to camera, which I thought was beautiful. And I think that almost is what it is. It's like a teacher giving a private performance or test of how they might go about teaching this painting. And let me move past that, that's not relevant now. And so we started to think about how we might kind of subvert some of the performative reenactment ourselves. In one example, Ben taking on the role of the opposite gender or another gender. And we started to talk about how this felt. And in fact, the 2 slides after this are actually a quote from Ben. He says, I wonder what it might feel like to be a mum, which I thought was a totally beautiful thing to have come out of his entering into the gestural and slowly mental space of the character that he was performing. We also thought about how the way in which we hold our bodies, our gestures, might change the way we feel emotionally in space, how they might change the sense of power we have in a public space or a classroom dynamic, and how that might enable us to understand the kind of emotional relationships that are set up in the painting, but also the dissonances we might feel with that. The painting is quite clearly gendered with the lamenting woman, to quote Friedlander, on one side, and this scene of masculine self-sacrifice on the other. And it was interesting chatting to Ben as well about the dissonances in feeling here. One might not feel like they want to lament today when seeing that same image of such kind of virulent violence about to take place. And we then also started to play really quite intuitively with different props that we had around us in the classroom, to sort of undercut some of the props and images in this scene. In one instance, Ben quite intuitively picked up a dry whiteboard marker, this small plastic stubby pen, in place of a sword, which I found really quite beautiful and a wonderful way to critique the elements of masculinity depicted in this scene, to pull them into the classroom, but also, I suppose, to think about how the pen might be mightier than the sword. And just one final set of images to show before I conclude. We then started to look at how we might use other tools around us in the classroom to kind of DIY costumes. And of course, schools often have sort of industrial numbers of post-it notes. And we started to play with this material as a way to make costumes. And what's so fascinating was the resistances that this material had. We ended up taping things together. They fell off. It became almost like a plumage. On one hand, it was armor. On the other, it was falling to pieces. And it absolutely changed the way in which Ben had to act. But I think more than anything, it involved incredibly attentive learning and incredibly attentive engagement with the material, as well as a lot of fun and humor in the process of creating this sort of surreal costume. I've really been toying with how to finish this short presentation, and I thought, I don't know if I really want to finish on someone else's words, but actually, I think I do right now. Maybe even as a provocation for responses in the questions. But I think what this work is really looking to answer, or at least be in dialogue with, are the questions set out by Peggy Phelan in Unmarked. And she writes, how can one create a performative pedagogy in the West which refuses the acquisitive model of power knowledge operative everywhere in institutions of higher education? How can one teach the generative power of misunderstanding in a way they'll almost understand? And I think for us, it was about how we might enter into the gestural and mental space of the characters, but also, you know, the students who performed these characters in this initial atelier, and how the recreation for our time today might create a sort of dissonance gap in which we could start to have very interesting discussions about the nationalist aims of the painting, the gendered aims of the painting, and how some of these themes might be transposed, but also resisted in our kind of new day-to-day. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Scott. Great. Lots to think about in teaching practices, but it also is beginning to cross over with some of our other colleagues looking at performance and the theater and different kinds of pedagogies. So thank you so much. There'll be lots to talk about in a second. Okay, so now we move on to Yunqi.
Yeah.
Put comments in the chat as well if that helps, or questions that you may want to ask of Kat later as well.
Okay, thank you too. I'm going to share my screen now. Here's my screen.
Yep, got it.
Yep, great. So thank you for having me today. And I would like to introduce my research on the situatedness in the graphic design of independent art publishing practice in China. And this sentence sounds kind of complicated, especially I'm going to introduce my research question. It's how does the graphic design of book under the table present transformative situatedness in the context of art book fairs and publishing practice in China? So it sounds like a really complicated sentence with a lot of concepts need to be explained about. So I would like to begin with a clarification of terminology to help people without the cultural background to better understand the scenario that I'm focusing on and the practice-led strategy I'm using in my practice-led in my practice research. In English, the word publish seems relatively straightforward. But however, in Chinese, it is translated into multiple terms, and each word actually carrying slightly different meanings. For example, the 出版 publish refers specifically to producing a book or magazine for public distribution. And other terms such as 刊登, 发布, 发表, and 公布, it's actually related to publishing in newspaper, online dissemination, or making information public. And what is most important here is that I use the word publication, and the word publication in Chinese literally means published object, and is strongly tied to the idea of a bookish physical form. So this kind of linguistic specifically already suggests that the publishing in China is not only a cultural practice, but actually a kind of materiality and institutional defined one. And different language have different habits of understanding, which make the research complicated to direct apply art book and fanzine theory in English to the Chinese context. And in the English language academic discussion, artistic book and fanzine are actually two terms that are differentiated, but however, conceptual confusion always occurred in the Chinese practice environment. So as a publisher, I aware that I'm doing independent art publishing, and this kind of word is based on art book fairs and art book store. And in terms of format, it cannot be fully categorized as a fanzine or artistic book. It's something in between. But when I'm trying to describe my practice to the audience outside of the Chinese-speaking scenario, people will feel that the concept of art publishing kind of blur and kind of difficult to understand. And sometimes they will understand the book fair as a place to let the publisher communicate together, but actually it's more in the Chinese specific scenario. And beside the cultural context, there's also a practical difficulty that needs to be aware of when talking about the publishing practice in China. That's the reason I'm going to introduce, because I call the practice environment it's complicated and specific. So basically, all publications without an ISBN number are considered illegal in China. And meanwhile, the right to issue the ISBN number is strictly controlled by the government-owned publisher. So as a result, a curator model of combining display and sale was created by the Art Book Fair in China, Art Book in China in 2013, and this has also allowed many independent art publications to legally exist. So basically, making a book in China, it's not an action that individual can do it independently. It's actually related to a bunch of elements that relate to cultural and political scenario. So as a result, the independent art publishing in China referred to a kind of passive, marginal printed matter, and it's between large-scale artist book and small press booklet. And it is actually active and legal based on not only specific practical sites like art book fairs or alternative art book store. As a result, we can only do legal bookmaking practice individually at the scenario of art book fairs and art book store. And although sometimes this kind of control can be unconscious. And however, the things become more and more complicated. The display and sale practice model is seeing a kind of shift since 2023 in China. The visibility of books format has been constantly cut back. For example, the biggest and the oldest art book fair in China announced that the art book fair will change to an art fair due to cultural and political pressure. So it's just a slightly change when you only focusing on the event name. But actually, from the book fair to the art fair, it is a kind of signal that the publishing scenario is happening a kind of transform in this situation. So my research is actually targets this kind of creation that create independently by individual practitioner in Chinese complicated publishing environments. And I call this kind of assistant book under the table, because as a practitioner, facing this kind of situation that sometimes the officer from the government will come and check our qualification, I will always hide our books under the table at the art book fair. So this seems like a kind of soft approach, soft reaction to this kind of scenario. You can see that I showed two pictures in the screen, and it's from my participatory research of the RCA Art Book Fair in Shanghai as an independent art publisher in 2023. And it is the curating unit in this fair presenting the practice in a gallery style. And you can see the second picture is the table of individual art publishing practitioners, which is similar to the table of the art book fair all over the world. So this kind of specific model of combining displaying and selling curating model is the initial situated strategy for the publishing infrastructure. And to understand this kind of situation, my research actually adopts a participatory action research approach in the initial stage of my research. The research is grounded in some case including the publishing scenario in Hong Kong and the RCA Art Book Fair now changed its name to the Art Fair in Shanghai, and some practice and exhibition in the Chinese Art Book Fair and Art Book Store. And the conclusion is a kind of paradox leading to the willing of continuing practice and the self-censoring. So what is the response from the designer? I start to use my design strategy to the first practice project of this PhD. And this project served as the first case study, the first exploratory case study of my research. And this project is called The Interpretation Power of Memories. So it's a collection of forms in my daily life. The image part and the text part of the book are isolated, but they can be pieced together through the interaction between the audience and the practitioner, which is myself. And the viewer can write new story on slip of paper by associating their feelings, relating their feeling with image in the main part of the book, which can later be put onto different pages by different viewers. And I have this kind of proposed model of iteration, which makes the audience, the readers, can have a kind of interaction with the books and try to create their own story to the books. But of course, different situation. The book is subject to different judgments of legitimacy, from a street side mobile phone replay show to a design award exhibition. Audience are given fewer opportunity to engage with the book, and the originally intended reading experience actually become destroyed by processing of professionalization and institutionalization. So this is an installation I present at the RCA Research Biennale last year. It's simulating the table of an art book fair, and two types of books were placed on the table. The first one is the Chinese dictionary, which is the symbol of the official culture. The second one is the book work of myself. So 3 no reading signs were placed on the top of and around the table, and meanwhile, a huge number of visitors continuing reading the books on the table, ignoring the signs. It's actually a kind of metaphor for the current situation of independent art publishing in China. For example, in one of my work, I use signs such as no reading, no making. However, this kind of sign produce the opposite effect. Audience continue reading and people continue making. So this actually creates what I describe as a double-mind situation. A situation where restriction and action coexist, revealing the underlying contradiction of the censorship. So the censorship is always exists, but the people just ignoring, and we are using a kind of soft approach to do the strategies towards this kind of situation. So now comes to the second stage of my practice. I'm trying to use 6 different publications to present different perspectives on interpreting books under the table, including a printed journal published by a university and a book on the table published by an art and design publishing company, and 2 design magazines and 2 publications published by the organizer of Art Book Fair, which can be considered as the book under the table. So I noticed that graphic design actually plays different roles in publication across different positions within the publishing infrastructure. So graphic design in this research is not a tool to help carry contents anymore. It is actually a strategy to face the transformative reality. And this is the core thing of my research, graphic design and transformative situatedness. So in this sense, situatedness can be understood as the creation of condition through which problem emerge. Therefore, I propose using my publishing project, Promised Land, as the initial thread of the case 3 and as the iteration process of my practice. So this is actually a method to continuing construct such condition, trying to figure out a kind of unexpected association from the audience of my practice, and it can serve as a site for the emerge of problem within the within this kind of environment of art book fair. So this is a kind of no traditional board game, and the player moves through a sequence of events by rolling dice. And by rolling dice, they can eventually go into different spaces and receive different command of different command of the game. And however, rather than relying on strategy, a right to the endpoint is actually without any value compared to compared to regular board game. So use this kind of board game, I try to reconstruct the concept of book and use it as a way to let the audience given interpretation to the specific publication by themselves, so they can actually generate their story through the process of playing this game. And this project is actually displayed and explored by visitors at an art book fair in Hangzhou, China in April 2026. And as a counterpart, I also brought this project to the London First Chinese Language Art Book Fair, and it is working in progress and seeing the future change. So to the end of my presentation, I'm trying to explain a kind of complicated concept through the introduction to the fully rich bunch of content, and I feel I noticed that might be kind of complicated and difficult to understand, but I still wanna to explain that the transformative situation actually means that the graphic design is both saturated and transformative, and it is actually not only shaped by a specific context, for example, the context that I as a practitioner always be in, and this kind of graphic design, this kind of action, and this kind of activism production is actually having the ability to reshape the content through a kind of new form of circulation, interaction, and interpretation. And there is actually three aspects included in the transforming action. It's actually, first of all, it's transforming the position of the book, and second, it's transforming the relationship between designer and the reader, and the third is transforming publishing ecologies by a way that using books as an activism object to show the entire process of the iterative of the strategy to facing the environment. And as third discussion in comparing being and becoming, the transformative situation of independent art publishing is actually saying that their meaning is not fixed in the book itself. It's actually the meaning is continuing emerge through their movement across different fairs, different publishing communities, and different readers and the publishing network. So as a practitioner, I am aware that making book is not aiming to make book. It's actually to provoke a kind of interpretation through the iterative making process in the scenario when facing the different aspects pressured from the authority. Yeah, so I'm still seeing the future change of this project, and I hope that I can get a final answer of my research. And although as a practitioner, we are always facing a kind of hurricane, especially in the specific context of interculture. But I hope that the practice can be a way to show how the things happen and how what kind of method we can choose, what kind of method we can use to face a reality. So basically, this is my presentation. I'm kind of nervous. You can see that, but anyway, thank you very much for listening to my works. Yeah.
Great. Thanks so much. Excellent. So transformation seems to be coming out very
I noticed that.
Brilliant. Great. Okay. On to Gareth.
Thank you. Thanks, Kat and Yunqi, for brilliant presentations so far, and I'm delighted to be back here. I must forewarn you, there was a storm cloud hovering above my flat earlier, which was disrupting my internet connection. So I do apologize if I do cut out at any point. And I hope to get back with you as soon as possible, but fingers crossed it will be okay. So as I said at the beginning, I've just submitted my thesis. I'm awaiting my viva later this month, and I work on contemporary French poetry that expands definitions of the poetic towards intermedial artistic practices. And I've researched that in the work of Christophe Tarkos, Michel Métaille, and a third figure which I'm going to talk about today, Anne James Chatton, who is a poet and multidisciplinary artist. Let me just start sharing my screen. Can you all see my slides?
Yes.
That looks like a yes. Thank you. So, through his practice of collecting found texts such as bills and receipts, Anne James Chatton's creative practices explore how contemporary subjecthood in 21st century capitalist society is increasingly marked by material and digital traces of our consumer choices, identity documentation, surveillance technology, and the recording of personal data. The pervasiveness of these data-intensive practices prompts his artistic response, where the act of recontextualizing text makes his work more perceptible amid the existing media landscape. The act of reframing is how Chatton himself characterizes his own practice. I quote him, "Je ne fais que cadrer." I just set the boundaries or the frame. I move one object from its place of original inscription to bring it into another place of inscription. That's my only gesture. After that, it's the publishers who turn it into poetry. It's the bookseller who agrees to distribute the publisher that turns it into poetry. It's the program for whatever event in inviting me says that I write poetry, etc. So for Chatton, practically any text generated by any means is open to be interpreted as an art object, which is largely consistent with what Hal Foster observes as a move in contemporary artistic practice, away, I quote, away from the logic of avant-gardist transgression toward a model of deconstructive displacement. If that transgression model, demonstrated, for example, by the situationist practice of détournement, which aimed to break through the consumerist society of the spectacle, it now, in our contemporary moment, seems harder than ever to make this break, but ever more pressing to make these sorts of artistic interventions. So his displacement and repurposing of pre-existing texts, rendering them more visible, I argue, operate by focusing an audience's attention on the way the text manifests through different media. So let me just show you an example. The works I'm discussing today are featured in a collection of visual works, I Have the Solution for the Planet, which came out in 2022. Many of these works are posted also on Chatton's Instagram page. And as a social media platform that encourages a highly curated approach to self-representation and expression, that adds another layer of self-reflexivity. So I, or je, is represented textually in his work. We do not typically see the artist's own appearance in his work on this most visual of social media platforms. And his method is what I might characterize as a process of overwriting. And I use this term in several senses to encompass the range of operations that he uses. Overwriting recalls the work's basis as a record or a trace of an activity or an event. Of course, digital files can be overwritten, often with the implication that the original has been changed in some way. And in another sense, to describe a work of writing as overwritten indicates that a sense of excessiveness. And yet the contemporary digital sphere is textually excessive. We all know that. Writing on the subject of the attention economy, Yves Citon characterizes the circulation of cultural goods today as a situation of overabundance. And J. Bolter also notes the rise of digital plenitude as concurrent with a breakdown of cultural hierarchies. And so by focusing on this superabundance of writing, Chaton reflects the breakdown of media barriers through a combination of different registers. Chaton uses overwriting to attend to text no longer as just documents, but as storytelling objects. Adam C. Jones, drawing on Jean Baudrillard's ecstasy of communication, identifies this experience of pleasure in the act of self-publication. I quote, "Through the personal account, a personal brand of sorts, one achieves the pleasure of curating one's own exhibitionism." Yet Chaton's personal brand on Instagram, as you can see, appears stripped of the hallmarks of social media visual culture content, such as bright colors, personal address to camera, and attention-grabbing hooks. The question that Chaton poses is exactly where the I becomes identifiable with a singular person on this platform. And in so doing, he's co-opting the social media platform, exploiting its inherent narcissistic gaze in order to short-circuit the medium. It's an instance of intervening in the contemporary media ecology in order to make space for the poetic imaginary amid a superabundance of text and media. And so he explores this question in his series of work, Réclame, where je, or the first person pronoun in many languages, English included, are inserted into well-known advertising slogans. The example shown here is riffs on Apple's advertising slogan, think different, to just add I think different. So réclame, the verb réclamer means to demand or to call for or require, which is suggestive of how advertising calls upon an audience and demands attention from them, determining in large part what Yves Citon calls the ecology of attention. So by placing the I within various corporate brand identities, Réclame demonstrates how modern individualism is far from individual, but is instead a hybrid construction dependent on the language of the corporation. Consumerism incorporates the subject into its attentional economy through text-image interpolations. There is a precedent in contemporary art of reappropriating advertising slogans and their imagery. For example, Barbara Kruger's works, such as I Shop, Therefore I Am, speak to the critique of consumerism and its effects on personal freedom. Her use of typography and design principles from marketing interrogates the relationship between art and advertising. The effect of Chaton's work, building on Kruger, demonstrates the even further advanced merging of consumerism and selfhood today. In this context, purchasing power becomes the primary indicator of subjecthood. These works also speak to the increasing use of individual statistical consumer profiles by large brands. Citon uses the term depersonalization to characterize the split subjecthood this data gathering induces. And I quote, it involves an inextricable mixture of processes of personalization, which vary and recombine takes incessantly in order to more closely target the needs, positions, and desires that are supposed to be ours, and processes of depersonalization, which channel the stimuli reaching us according to aggregative computations where our singular process of becoming is doomed to model itself on a statistical profile that is not really that of anyone, but just a theater mask or a persona with which financial greed seeks to identify us. the persona generated through the data profile of the consumer is the je of réclame, the desiring subject that we are encouraged to identify with. Je savoure l'instant, or I savor the moment, is based on a marketing slogan for Coca-Cola in France. And this example is particularly prescient as the slogan designates the promise of a temporality that is promised to arrive through the purchase of a product. To enjoy the moment, one must buy into it. What is more, there is also something eerie about the first-person formulation against a blank background. It seems to speak of a disconnected self, where language is only self-referential, and corporate brand identity matters more than the human expression, and environment is reduced to a white or a blank surrounding space. And one of these works, which you already saw at the beginning, gives its title to Chatton's collection, I Have the Solution for the Planet. It originates from an IBM advertising slogan, Solutions for a Small Planet. Joe Melvin, in an essay included in the collection, writes how the phrase sounds grandiose and despotic, evoking a sort of villain caricature. And she also associates Chatton's irreverent appropriation of corporate branding with pataphysics, which was an art movement which described itself as the science of imaginary solutions. So talking about this affinity, Melvin writes that I have the solution for the planet, I quote, becomes a mediation on the state of the world and on us, our condition as a transitional phase like tourists in the Earth's history. Us in relation to it, in relation to its existence. The existence we have with our feet on the ground, vertically, horizontal, and supine. And of course, this has led me to reflect on how the slogan reimagined by Chatton takes on significance, a greater significance in the face of climate crisis, expressing a corporate entity's ambition to, let's say, geoengineer the climate. And this brings about the question of, again, of who I is and how I wields power. And so when we talk about the Anthropocene, the current geological epoch, which has gained traction in eco-critical and ecological environmental humanities, the anthropos of Anthropocene, the human, is perhaps too easily conceived as one homogeneous entity. And I turn to T.J. Demos's Against the Anthropocene to look for a critique of the Anthropocene, where he says that the Anthropocene functions as a universalizing discourse. It tends to disavow differentiated responsibility and the differently located effects for the geological changes it designates, instead homogeneously allocating agency to the generic members of its human activities. It's incredibly generalizing, in other words. So while Demos's critique of Anthropocene visual culture is largely aimed at the aesthetics of industrial scale effects on the landscape, he talks about the photographs of Edward Burtynsky, for example. We might use Demos's intervention to explore how Chatton's work highlights the universalizing discourse of the Anthropocene. Réclame seems to ask, who is the I behind the anthropos of corporate brand identity? This question points to the fact that the solutions, whatever they may be, are in the hands of any economic elite rather than the I of the supposedly free subject under capitalism. A monumentalizing concept of the Anthropocene may need to be overwritten in favor of a more nuanced, non-homogenizing account of human agency in the face of climate crisis. So Chatton is reminding us where our agency is being, and our agency and our attention, crucially, is being redirected. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you so much, Gareth. And again, congratulations on getting to this point in your journey as well. Fantastic. Graham, it's over to you.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. This talk is about the RCA's Department of Design Research Archive, but it's also about a wider problem: how design knowledge survives, how it becomes visible, and how it can be reactivated when the archive is incomplete. The image here is of Bruce Archer, Professor Bruce Archer, and an administrator. It's useful because it immediately places the project in a working research culture, rather than in an abstract theory of archives. And as much as the protagonist, Professor Bruce Archer, is central to the Department of Design Research, it's also the filing system and the ephemera in the background, which is of importance to the archive. This is a department where design research is being made through projects, documents, people, prototypes, funding relationships, and institutional decisions here at the RCA. So my central concern is not simply to recover what happened. It's to critically ask how traces of past design research can be made usable again, especially when those traces are partial, contested, or unevenly described. The phrase testamentary traces matters, and I'm using it to describe materials that do not just record the past, but bear witness to it. So reports and catalogues and project files and photographs, including oral histories, metadata, and absences. These traces cannot speak automatically. They need to be connected, interpreted, and activated. The question behind the presentation is therefore, what happens when an archive is treated as evidence, but also as a site of research practice? This slide introduces the shift I'm making in the project from the archive as a place where evidence is found to the archive as something that can itself become method. The DDR was formative in British design research. It connected design practice to healthcare, disability, education, computing, industrial production, and public administration. But the archive does not present that history in a simple or complete way. It's partial, unevenly described, and often difficult to access as a research object. And to give you some examples, on the top left-hand side is John Wood, and he developed a control center for Stratpipe Police. Underneath at the bottom here is the King's Fund NHS hospital bed, which was reproduced in its thousands. And it's Kenneth Agnew is the designer. And on the top right-hand side is a commode for spina bifida children at the Cotswold School. So the contribution is not historical, but also practical and structured. It builds ways to move through the archive, organize its traces, and test what forms of design knowledge surface when the archive is made legible. And this slide sets up the problem more precisely. Traditional archival approaches are extremely strong at close reading, contextual interpretation, and evidential care. And I don't want to dismiss this. In fact, the project depends on those strengths. The limitation appears when the object of study is distributed. In this archive, design knowledge is not always located in a single document, named author, or finished output. It's spread across project files, catalogue descriptions, reports, job numbers, funder names, staff histories, student thesis, object records, photographs, and institutional memory. In fact, there are 192 boxes at the V&A East Storehouse. That distribution creates visibility. Some things survive but remain difficult to search. Some things are catalogued but flattened by metadata. Some forms of knowledge sit outside the formal record altogether, especially when they're carried through conversations, project routines, administrative decisions, or later recollections. The table on the slide is therefore not a rejection of archival scholarship. It's a diagnosis. Close reading remains essential, but it struggles to trace dispersed relationships at scale. Catalogue description is necessary, but it can normalize uncertainty. Institutional memory is valuable, but it can sit outside searchable systems. So the opportunity is to add an interpretive layer, computational methods, structured metadata, oral histories, and user interface design. These don't necessarily solve the archive, they help ask different critical questions of it. This slide shows the project's conceptual framework. The important point is that it's not a project with a conventional separation between research material and research method. And in fact, it intends as much to look forwards as much as look backwards. The practical work of building, structuring, and testing the digital archive is part of the inquiry. Archival analysis gives evidential care and historical context. Oral histories help reconnect traces that may not be fully explained by formal records. So this is where testamentary traces become more than a descriptive phrase. The trace can be a document, category, an absence. So the thesis asks how these traces can be mobilized without erasing their uncertainty. This slide moves from method to contribution. Project is not only asking what the DDR archive contains, it's asking how archival visibility is produced. The map on the slide represents a way of thinking about DDR memory as a set of connected traces. Some are intended: catalogues, reports, projects, and staff records. Others are less stable: critical oral accounts, institutional recollections, project categories, terminology, gaps, missingness. The argument is that archives do not become useful simply because material has survived. They become useful through the limitation appearing when the object study is distributed. This slide is an early example of the project's computational and visual analysis, and it's deliberately modest. I'm not claiming that the diagram discovers the truth of the archive. I'm using it to test what becomes visible when project data, people, and funder categories are brought into relation. So these are three separate data sets that have been put together. And this is what's called an alluvial diagram. It maps EDR projects across 3 dimensions: project lead, applied research cluster, and funder type, moving left to right. The width of each ribbon represents the number of projects passing through that relationship. The reason I've kept the diagram in a single monotone grey is important as well. Colour would make it far too decorative. And here the point is structure and density, and recurrence and distribution. But several patterns have already become visible. Kenneth Agnew in the middle has a strong presence, especially in health and hospital equipment. And John Wood is concentrated around police control rooms. Another lead researcher, Patrick Purcell, spans product and industrial design, built environment infrastructure, and computing and information systems. On the right, the public sector funders and commercial funders from industry appear, and are especially important routes through which the DDR work was supported. The diagram also keeps the categories unrecorded lead at the bottom left and unrecorded and other funders. And this is intentional because they are not merely data problems to be cleaned away. They show the unevenness of the archival record and remind us that visibility is not the same as completeness. So the value of the diagram isn't that it replaces interpretation. It helps identify where close reading, oral history, or further archival research might now be needed. So rather than describe the project on a level of method, let me try and give you a quick demo. Can you see the screen? Hold me close. Let me check what I did this morning. Bear with me. There we go. So this is the open API that's being built. And just to give you a quick look at the data sets that are already in here, we can have the DDR core staff agents have been digitized. And this is an open API system. And also to give you an example of the material in here, this is the work of Kenneth Agnew and Hospital Bedstead, as well as documentation. And this is all being digitized using Abby and is all OCR'd. The final slide brings the project back to its larger implications. The reason for this approach is that archival reactivation requires more than digitization. It requires oral history interpretation, metadata enrichment, retrieval augmented archival interpretation, or RAG, embodied or visual analytics, and checking against the historical context. The yellow Venn diagram describes these methods. That overlap is important because no single method is sufficient. Oral histories can add context, but may be partial or retrospective. Metadata can structure relationships, but may impose categories. Computational tools can surface patterns, but can also amplify bias. Interface design can make material accessible, but it also shapes what users think, and that's important. So looking ahead to year 2, the project's next phase is about responsibility as much as capability. The methods needs to stay critical, especially around bias, topic modeling, and AI-assisted interpretation. Institutionally, the project raises questions about how digital record keeping can operate at scale while remaining open, trustworthy, and usable. The broader claim is that computational historiography should not mean handling interpretation over to machines. It should mean building systems that make interpretation more accountable, showing what evidence is being connected, where uncertainty sits, and how archival categories shape what can be known. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Graham. Fantastic. That was a good one to end up on in terms of kind of research processes, coming right back to the archive and what it brings to our understanding. If we can, I'm just looking at time. If we can take maybe a 5-6 minute break, get away from the screen for a little bit, get up and walk around. And during that time, if you can think of questions or comments you would like to make on each of our speakers' presentations, then please put those in the chat or be ready to raise your hand to ask questions of our speakers. So we'll join back in about 5 or 6 minutes then. Thank you very much. I'm going ahead and get started again. So thanks everyone, and thanks so much for those fantastic presentations. A lot to take in, a lot to think about. So let's try to unpack some things for the next 20 minutes or so. We've got a couple of questions in the chat already, and I'm wondering, Yunqi, do you want to articulate what you've said in the chat?
Yeah. I just read the question. I really appreciate that you associate my work to the Chinese artist Xu Bing's work, because Xu Bing is actually one of the most famous book artists in China, and he has a lot of impact to me. Although our category might only overlap a little bit, because I am doing actually a kind of copy of the artistic book and doing a smaller scale of works, but I feel like our understanding of the symbol and intercultural precision have some in some ways echoes to each other. So I really appreciate this kind of comments, and thank you so much. And about the feedback from reader, if I understand correctly, I would like to, I will say that this is a kind of iterative process. So as I have just introduced, the first case of my research is the book full of contracts and form from a Chinese person's daily life. And in that book, in the practice process of that book, I'm seeking the feedback, seeking the individual story that can associate to the image part of the book. But during my process, I noticed that this kind of exploitation, the thing I really receive is actually different from my expectation, from my imagination, from my design of the feedback of the work. So this is a kind of unexpected association from the audience during the specific process of the communication. So this kind of step actually helped me to provoke the iteration next step of my practice, that I am not seeking specific story, not seeking specific category response in the design of my design strategy. I am actually seeking the possibility of creating unexpected association, unexpected imagination, and provoke different dialogue during the understanding of a specific symbol with people with different background, no matter cultural background or education background or the practice background. Maybe some of the participant of some of the reader and audience of my work, it's not working in the art and design. They are actually from other expertise and other area of practice, other area of theory. They will have different perspective of the association and different inspiration of the dialogue. I think this is the next step and the iteration step of my practice, especially talking about how I expect from the reader. So I hope this can explain a little bit of the question. Yep.
Thanks, Steffi, for that question. Anybody else want to pick up on anything that Yunqi said before we go on to the next question? Yes, Kat.
Would you mind talking a bit more about the role of the table in the artist book fair? It's such an interesting object, and I know artists like Sarah McKillop have really started to investigate the book fair table in their own work. So yeah, could you talk about a bit more what you're getting underneath?
Yeah, sure. It's actually great. It's actually a great question because I noticed during my practice that the table actually serve as a unit as the smallest unit of the practice of the art revere. And this is actually a kind of general understanding because in the art revere from all over the world, also, although we know that the source of the art revere is actually from the New York printed matter, but actually all of the world art revere trying to copy this kind of strategy to their art revere practice, and the table actually serve as the smallest unit of the artist. But in the specific practice scenario in China, I think the table is interesting as a symbol of what can be given the permission of appearing in the specific scenario. So to be specifically explain about the concept, I think the table actually is a kind of platform or a kind of carrier or a kind of vehicle that show that this kind of thing is it's supposed to appear in the art fair. And during the art fair, during my practice, actually, before 2023, I show all my book on the table. I am an individual practitioner. I make artist book by myself, and obviously, I can't get a book number because I am not a big publishing company. So I am doing the published practice more like producing a kind of printed matter as a designer and a visual artist. But after the stricter control of from the government, from the authority, I was supposed to hide a part of my practice under the table. So the table is actually serve as a kind of standard and a kind of filter of the practice in the specific scenario. So I am actually trying to figure out what kind of design strategy practitioner are used to face this kind of situation, where they are hoping that most of their work can appear and can create a kind of space of communicate with the audience of art of fair. So this kind of strategy it's of course situated and also it is actually facing a kind of change of the specific scenario. It's not a still strategy. It's actually always facing change. So I think the table serve as this kind of symbolized existence. And so that's also the reason why I choose book under the table. I choose this phrase as a description of the independent art publishing in China, because as I've said, the term in the independent art publishing in China, it's actually kind of blurred and kind of hard to be understand. But the book under the table actually provide a kind of chance to tell a story. So I think I really appreciate that you notice about the importance of the table that served in my research. Yeah, I hope that can answer this question. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Great. Okay. So I just want to maybe make an observation, and we'll come back, Steffi, to your second question for Kat. But I'm very interested, Graham, in Yunqi's talking about the table and the significance of that within her project. Your first slide of your presentation of Bruce Archer and the secretary, as they were then known, and your comments around what's in the background, as well as the interaction between the two main characters in the slide. You never really got back around to stuff that was going on in the background, and how are you going to be treating that within this system that you're developing in terms of the archive?
I think certainly the photographic archive is fairly limited. Mm-hmm. At the DDR, but we can get a sense of operation in terms of it was about systematic design, and I think that comes across as well in the reports, and also digging deeper with the oral histories. What was design research? How did it function, and how did it operate? In a pre-digital era, and also from a pedagogical point of view, because the DDRs had a large intake of students when it was switched over to college funding in 1978. How did they teach? What materials did they use? Was it overhead projections? Was it scripted? So all of these things, the ephemera in the archive is as important as the key material, I think. And some of the clues are in the photographs, but the reality is it's just digging through box by box by box. And then, of course, having to make a critical choice on what to digitize and what not to digitize.
Right, thank you. And also what you're saying about pedagogy, this comes back to Kat. And what you were talking about with slide projections and, other kinds of more lo-fi technologies being used in the 1970s in artistic practice. What do you think about these objects? And in terms of your own work in art history, is there an archiving practice that's going on with those in relationship to the areas of interest that you have?
I mean, kind of interestingly, I'm actually sitting in an archive now in an artist's estate that is full of slides and transparencies that we use every day. But interestingly, we do need to be trained in being able to scan them to use it. So I do think it is quite a challenging skill to learn and develop, particularly because there's a requirement to be sensitive to the sort of aesthetics of the images as they age. So that's one interesting thing. As an artist, I've actually been offered slide collections from universities getting rid of their slide collections, and these weren't meant to be forever objects, and they are ephemeral, and the celluloid will return to the earth at some point. And I mean, the plastic won't, but the kind of filmic frame will. And I think there's something that maybe we can resign ourselves to with these archives, and that they are allowed to go. But I do think what's interesting is capturing the stories, as Graham was saying, from the people who worked with these, because it gives such insight into how people structure thinking, right? And just a small kind of reflection, I had a beautiful conversation with an Italian teacher of fashion history who said that she didn't know how to teach in 1994 because she'd suddenly lost her slide projection, which gave her the narrative flow and pace of her class. And I do think there's something there to be said for holding on to these media, because they're not obsolete. I think that's a fascinating thing, right? They're lo-fi, right? But we still have access to E100 slide film or black and white slide film. It's still a brilliant medium to use. We use film in fashion photography often rather than digital photos for its clarity. So in that sense, I think they offer a sort of different engagement, and often with the kind of beautiful density and opaqueness you get in the E100 film or in Velvia, you get that real kind of sculptural quality to images that you take. And I do think that affords a more kind of haptic or tactile engagement, particularly at large scale with the topic of study. So sorry, I hope I answered the question. I think I might have got interested and diverted a bit.
No, it's brilliant. I just love the fact that you're sitting in an archive as well. And, Graham's got his digital archive. I think there's something about, again, that materiality and talking about the objects that have substance and then how they're represented through different kinds of modes. So, no, brilliant. Let's stay with you just for the moment, because I want to come back to Steffi had a question for you as well in the chat, which was around performance. And so is performance likely to veer to the Baroque?
I thought this was a really lovely question, Steffi. Thank you for asking it. It seems a bit of a cheeky question, actually, which I also like. And David's students actually broke off when he painted the Rape of the Sabine Woman, which is also hanging in the Louvre. And it is kind of visibly Baroque in style, with these kind of undulating kind of curls and clouds coming out of costume and a much lighter kind of colour palette. So I think in that sense, yes, he was exactly moving towards that trajectory. And I think some of that was about the fashion of the time. He was a celebrated artist and from all accounts, wanted to remain kind of in that spotlight. But I think there's something more interesting really about the Baroque to unpick here. And I think for me, in a really kind of Deleuzian sense, thinking about the unfoldingness of the Baroque, and performance also opens up or kind of invites that sort of unfoldingness, the kind of flowing articulation of the self as you enter into kind of new spaces and new gestures, and that sense of movement and transition that you have within yourself as you start to kind of embody and embed yourself within a character. So I think in that sense, yes, there is something kind of beautifully Baroque about performance in that way. But I think there's also, and I'm not sure if this isn't Baroque, but there's also a sense of dissonance that performance invites. And again, I don't know if that isn't Baroque, but I think visually, and coming from that kind of visual place in art history, which is often where I start my thinking, I don't recognise this sense of aesthetic dissonance with the Baroque. So I do think using the kind of techniques that David used today does offer that dissonance. But perhaps it's a question of time and place. And then just also to kind of add to the Baroque, there's that interesting sense of kind of overwhelm or kind of felt space or kind of empathetic space that Baroque paintings or works often invite you into with their scale, their materiality, the way in which shapes kind of tumble into our own space and ask us to walk around them. And I do wonder if there's something there of the kind of irrationality, in inverted commas, of this sense of empathy that is invited by performance. And yes, so that would be my answer for now. But maybe my question back to you is, how would you define the Baroque? Where did this question come from?
No way I'm going to try and answer that, but it came from you, because you let slip that the David secessionists left because they felt they were engaged in something too Baroque, and I wondered if they were frightened of the sheer sort of emotional overwhelmingness of the performative approach to building a studio, and whether it was that or whether they were noticing something else that they wanted to pursue in their practice and about which I know nothing. But I was just interested in what performance does once you bring it into a studio, as you were describing and as you're describing in terms of pedagogy as well.
I mean, if I may quickly respond to that. I think there's something interesting here about the kind of prefigurative nature of the performance in David's studio. Like, when you look at the rest of his practice around the revolutionary kind of parades and festivals, it is absolutely about kind of performing a space in which you will then move into. It's a sort of the creating of a political imaginary that will then be taken up as the kind of lived reality of the people who have created this performative space in which to enter. And I do think there's something perhaps about the political aesthetics or the kind of, the political aesthetics of the neoclassical in relation to the Baroque that's fascinating there. And yet to be unpicked further for me.
Right. It just shows when you say one word in a presentation how, important that single word is. And somebody like Steffi will pick up on it. So thanks so much for that question. The next one is for Gareth and Graham. And Eric, do you want to ask your question?
Well, I'm not sure that I would phrase it differently. I suppose I was just struck by in your very different presentations, this whole question of and Kat just used the term, that sense of overwhelm, as you said, as you put it, this incessant proliferation of material, of things, of utterances and data. I was just wondering, what in your very diverse types of research you felt that your subjects can teach us about those things that don't fit into that, into the archive, the things that are left out. Should they be brought in? Should they be kept out? What are the consequences of those decisions?
It's a very good question. The brief history of the DDR archive was that it was rather unceremoniously dumped on at the V&A. In 1985, Bruce Archer literally ran across the road, so the story goes, and because he was so afraid that it was going to get shredded. under the instructions of Jocelyn Stevens, who was the rector here. The V&A have done a reasonable pass on it, but it still remains pretty much as it was from 1985, 1986. I think archivists, professional archivists, would argue absolutely not everything should ever be digitized. In fact, they're quite adamant about that. And certainly, I think my responsibility here is to have some form of access, available on a smartphone. Make it, and this is also the strategy of V&A: get the stuff out of the storerooms. And I think it's perfectly okay to do, what's within reason. I think Neil Parkinson at Special Collections here would also support the idea that not everything absolutely should be archived. The same with the team at the University of Brighton, are very keen to actually ensure that, okay, we'll preserve everything as best we can, but there shouldn't be a mad grab to digitize everything, because you'll always miss something. And it's also a pleasure to visit an archive and to actually, touch these things and smell them as well. I think in that sense, I'm probably a populist, trying to get as much out within reason, and then use that as a funnel to perhaps draw people in.
Gareth?
Yes, well, on the question of the archive, I've been talking about a practitioner who is in many ways a sort of self-archivist. He's making a sort of performance of his own archive. And in that sense, I think that is a comment in itself on the overabundance of material and a sort of raising of the question of what exactly should be included, what is of interest, and it often flips the question on its head by putting the material front and center, as opposed to the visual likeness of a person, like the image. By bringing the text or focusing on the text, it's but through a sort of recontextualized, remediated way, it's offering new perspectives on that overabundance. And if I may, I could relate that to Min's question in the chat, where she asked me about my use of poetic imaginary, whether that works through a sort of intervening in this sort of social media practice. I think yes, I sort of agree with you, Min, like with your comparison with Munoz. It's what is already there, but how can we treat it differently? I really like that idea. I don't know Munoz's work that well, but that sounds like a really fascinating comparison to me. And the poetic imaginary I see as a kind of where the image has been somewhat sort of reinterpreted through treating it as a text. So sorry, I tried to answer two questions in one there, but I hope that covered things.
That's great. Thanks so much, Gareth. And thanks, Eric, for those questions as well. And then, so we're just a little after 7 p.m. London time, and we said we would start at 7 or stop at 7. Well, we can continue on, but I think everybody wants their dinner. So just to say that fantastic start to a conversation, and one that we're going to continue next week with our additional speakers. We will be starting at 4 o'clock, from 4 to 6 London time next week. same format, and with the links, we'll get those. I think, Carolyn, you got the links already sorted out for next week.
But this one I have. The next one we'll do.
Yeah, so what Carolyn, our administrator, will get the links out to everybody as well for next week. But just to say, thanks so much for the speakers and their presentations, and thanks for the questions. There's some really good ones there. And we could have continued on into the evening, but I think we'll draw it to a close now. James, anything that you want to add?
No, I mean, let me just say how wonderful the session was. And there was one word that, if I can just myself just sort of emphasize, and that was attentiveness or attention, and different sorts of attention that people were talking about. And that is what I'm sort of taking here, that one can sort of talk about, you know, transformation and knowledge, but also fundamentally critical attention and the different forms that can take, including missingness, to use Graham's fantastic phrase in his presentation. And it's with that sense of a renewed sense of critical attention that I'm looking forward to the next session next week. So thank you, Teal, for organizing this so beautifully, your end, and getting everything ready for our next session. Thank you.
Thanks so much, James. And again, thanks to all the presenters. Brilliant. And I'm sure we couldn't send the cookies and the grapes that are sitting in the middle of the table that we've been nibbling on. But next week, I'm sure we'll have similar bounty to share. So anyway, thanks so much, and we'll see everybody next week. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.